Hi everybody, this is Matt with Driftwood Tide Music, and this is the second of my mix tutorials on my cover of Reconsider Baby. In the last section we covered the rhythm section, and today we're going to be covering an additional rhythm guitar, the piano, and the horns. And you're hearing these unprocessed right now. I'll let you take a listen. As with basically everything else, we'll remind you that I'm using the Virtual Tape Machine plugin from Slate Digital being applied to all of these. That was done outside of the context of the mix. Also, every channel is using the Slate Digital Virtual Console, and we'll go ahead and we'll turn that on now. And again, we're using the Neve model. Now to the mixing. Let's start with the horns. The horns were actually created with samples using native instruments. I'm not going to go in and show you that, but there are a total of about 5 different horn parts, including solo instruments and ensembles. And really the only thing I'm doing in native instruments is setting some basic volume and panning for the horns as a group. So I committed those tracks to a stereo audio file as early in the mix as possible. Really at the first opportunity that I had the performance dialed in the way I wanted. And so let's go ahead and we'll listen to those. The first thing we're doing on these is running them through a compressor. The compressor we're using is the Waves V-Comp, which is a Neve-inspired compressor. You can hear a little obvious boost in volume with the compressor, but you'll notice, as has been the case with most everything so far, we're pretty gentle with our processing. We're reaching up around 3, maybe 4 decibels of gain reduction at the most during the song, using a soft, 2-to-1 ratio, and not getting too crazy here. The next step for me is the Pultec EQ. Now, I use the Pultec a lot, and I should explain that just putting the Pultec on the track with no gain or cutting happening impacts your sound. It actually gives you a slight boost of volume, and it adds a little bit of warmth. That's true to the original hardware units, and so this is a mojo kind of piece where putting it on the track adds a little something to it. The actual EQ I'm doing is not that dramatic, as you'll hear. So I don't know if you could hear that or not. Basically, we're rolling off any stray real high frequencies that might be in there, and we're providing a little bit of extra oomph on the very bottom end. Even though there's not a lot of information going on down really low, you can get a little bit more warmth in the track by boosting down here. And then we're bringing out the clarity and brightness of the horns around 8K, and the Pultec does a great job of bringing in a little brightness and clarity without making it sound harsh. The next item up is another EQ from Pultec style EQ, and this one's focusing on mid-range frequencies. Again, the differences are pretty subtle. It looks like I've got this turned up to 4. You would expect, if you're not familiar with Pultec, to hear a huge difference in sound, but the Pultec, you can turn these knobs massive amounts and have it sound pretty subtle, which is really one of the reasons why I like it. So I'm boosting it at 500 Hertz to give it just a little more body, and I'm boosting at 2K to give it just a little more bite. I didn't like how much bite I was getting, and so I actually pulled back slightly at 1.5 just to temper this. And that's really all that's going on with the horns. It's very simple. We add a little reverb, and this reverb is the same reverb that is being used on the rhythm section. And because these levels are so low, it's actually sending almost nothing into the reverb, which is fine because it creates the sound I'm after. So you'll see these meters barely move. One thing I want to do now, though, is I want to talk about bleed. In a real studio, if I was standing around with a group of real musicians playing real instruments and we're recording together, there's going to be bleed. The drums, the sound of the drums is going to be creeping into the mics on the guitar amps, and the guitar amps are going to be bleeding into the sound of the horns. And in older records especially, where it was more common for all the musicians to be together in the same room playing, that actually works to your advantage in some ways in helping to really create a glue that ties everything together in a very organic way. So I wanted to recreate that, being as the whole purpose of this recording is to have that kind of classic feel. So I'm going to let you hear with the rhythm section unmuted, and I think you'll find this interesting. So I've got the individual instruments in the rhythm section muted, but I've got the bus, the sub, on, and you'll hear a little guitar and a little piano. What I've done on the instruments is I've taken a little bit of every instrument and I'm sending it off into the rhythm sub. I didn't show this in the last demo, but what that does is these sounds become part of the rhythm section. They get compressed and processed with them, and it creates that bleed. So here's the horns in the context of the mix with the rhythm section. All right, let's move on to the piano. The first thing we're doing with the piano is I'm just clearing out a little mud. I'm not really trying to shape the sound with this EQ. I'm really just trying to filter out a little bit of the low frequencies that come from a heavy left hand on the occasional note here and there, because I want them to not be impacting how the compressor reacts. So I turn that on. There's really nothing to hear other than a couple of notes throughout the whole performance that would really make a huge difference on. So the first real processor here is once again an 1176, and you'll see, unlike other tracks we've been working on, we have a lot of gain reduction going on the piano. The piano is very much meant to be in the background, and piano is an incredibly dynamic instrument when it's played well by a passionate player. And so what we're doing is we're controlling that. And I'm choosing the 1176 blue stripe version because I like the character of it, and has a fast attack and release. So you can hear it, but it's subtle. So it's helping control everything. Once I have it compressed, this is where I really make the biggest difference, I think, in how well it sits in the mix. And that's with some aggressive EQ. Actually, it's not even that aggressive, but I am cutting off more of the bottom end, and I'm giving a fairly heavy boost, about 6 decibels of boost for everything from 12 and up. What this will do is this will make the piano a little thinner and brighter. And let's hear how that sounds. So especially if I go on this section here where it's thick with chords. Hear how it really thins it out, and it makes it smaller, and smaller is what I need in the context of the mix. And so you hear how well it sits in the mix now that it's been controlled and made a little smaller. Let's move on to the guitar now. The first thing about the guitar is it's a very dynamic part. It actually switches to a slide guitar for one section, very dynamic, very poppy, very punchy sounding. And this is not a true rhythm guitar in the sense that we're popping in and out of the occasional lick here and there. So here's a rhythm section. And so then here we go into more of a lead section. So needed to strike some balance with this. The first thing I wanted to do though is I wanted to dirty this up a little bit more. It's a very dynamic, very snappy performance. I really like it, but in the context of the mix, we already have one very clean guitar, the jazzy rhythm guitar, and I wanted more contrast. Rather than use a guitar pedal, I actually opted to reamp the entire sound even though it's already been amped. So here's what that sounds like. Here's with it. Here's without it. Seeing here, it makes a big difference and changes the character. After that, again, this is a fairly dynamic performance, so I'm using the 1176 yet again. And you will see an occasional jump of the needle up into 5 or even 7 dB of gain reduction. But mostly, you see that we are still hitting it fairly lightly. We don't want to take the dynamics out, we just want to control them. So you can hear how that sits in the mix. And the last thing we do on this is as an EQ, we're clearing out a little of the low end, anything in the upper areas, giving it a little bit of boost near the end of the low end, tiny bit of bite, and then I'm actually gently backing off on some more of the higher frequencies. So we'll hear how that sounds. It's going to be very subtle though. So I don't know if you can appreciate the subtleties of some of these changes without hearing everything in context of the whole mix over a good sound system. One last thing I wanted to point out on the guitar. I do this a lot and you'll see it on the piano as well, but I've got a lot of volume automation. You can see this line here represents volume. Sometimes I draw this in using fader moves, literally riding the fader like this as it plays. And other times I draw it in using the mouse. This allows me to really control this much more than you can with compression. A lot of people want to control the dynamics with compression. Compression to me is a way of getting a tone or a sound you want, and yes, you can control the sound as well, but I would much rather use compression along with fader riding or volume automation to really control the dynamics the way I want. You can see I've got them gently rising through here, and then it jumps up for this lick, and then it comes back down. And what this allows me to do is to really go through the mix and control the dynamics much more than what I can with a compressor. You can see in this section I've got a lot of controlling. There's a lot of punchy parts here that needed to be pulled back just a little bit. So you can see I actually am accenting these notes, and I'm pulling back on these because they're a little too punchy. And again, this is a background part. I don't want it to overtake the other instruments. So let's hear all this. And that's it for this edition. The next one will be lead guitar. things.